Terror on the trail. Yes, this is the place, or if not, one much like it. A low spot near a stream, sheltered by willows, rapidly losing their leaves. Here they dug in, sheltered themselves as they could, tried to comfort the children. Yes, the story needs to be told. These folks need to know, otherwise the sacrifice was in vain and the lives of those children meaningless. Just think of how far they'd come. Across the prairies and the desert. 4 months they had traveled, with all their belongings, all their livestock, and 5 young children. And then to be stripped in just a few weeks' time of all they owned, their wagons, their animals, even their clothing, and to be huddled like this around a small fire in the midst of the wilderness, afraid, hungry, despairing, holding out for a rescue that might never come. Their party left too late, or traveled too slowly. Someone offended Colonel Howe at Fort Hall, and he limited their escort to just 6 days. After that, they were on their own, across the Snake River wilderness. At Fort Walla Walla, no one knew they were coming. Dozens of parties had made the crossing, all without trouble. No one knew that there was one last train, led by Elijah Utter, at Salmon Falls and driving westward, alone and without escort. 300 immigrants, and no one knew they were coming. There had been no trouble, and all was well, until the Indians appeared. Hundreds and hundreds of them, whooping and yelling, trying to stampede the cattle. The immigrants circled their wagons, corralling their animals, and set about defending themselves. The Indians fired on them with arrows and rifles. The immigrants fought back gallantly, but were horribly outnumbered. The screams of the dying and the wounded filled the morning air, growing louder and more agonizing as the day wore into night, and back to day again. The settlers battled bravely, killing hundreds of the savages, but their own casualties mounted and their supplies dwindled. The bodies of the dead were stacked like cordwood along the perimeter, shields of putrifying flesh to perfect the living. But the heathen hordes would not be denied. They rushed the wagons again and again, shooting their arrows and raising their knives against men, women, and children alike. None would be spared, it seems. When some 4 dozen survivors abandoned the wagons and made a break for the river and the shelter of rocks and trees. Only 4 horses remained, and were swiftly mounted by discharged soldiers in the party, deserters, I'm told, who armed themselves with rifles and pistols and promised to clear the way ahead and distract the savages while the others stole away. Off they rode, into the darkness, as fast as their mounts could carry them, away from the fight and the cries of the families they'd abandoned. Ne'er a look back had they, and not an ounce of conscience but for their own survival. Brothers Joseph and Jacob Reith helped the survivors, just 30 by now, most of them children, escaped to the river, while the savages plundered the wagons and divided up the animals. Their hideous war cries echoed across the plain, and the burning wagons lit up that terrible night. The Reith brothers went ahead for help, into the night, down the trail toward Oregon, while the others followed more slowly, babes in their arms and on their backs. Elijah Utter and his wife had been slaughtered, along with 5 of their 10 children. All but 4 of the men were dead. Just 3 families remained, the Van Ormans, the Myers, and the Chases, of the dozens who had made the crossing. They traveled by night, hiding themselves by day, making their way downriver some 60 or 70 miles, until they were too weak to go any further. The Van Ormans wanted to go on down the river, but the Myers and the Chases were too weak. "Do not leave us," they implored, and the Van Ormans stayed. They built wigwams from the willows and lay by day after day, waiting, hoping. They ate the dogs that were with them, gathered frogs and mussels from the river, and dug for herbs and bulbs. But it was not enough. They were famished. The Van Ormans wanted to move on down the river, but the Myers and the Chases said they were too weak. "God will provide," they said. "All we need do is pray." And the Van Ormans stayed. Indians started coming to them. The same ones who'd attacked their train? They could not tell. But they were desperate. The Indians had salmon to trade for the immigrants' rifles and blankets, and then their clothing. Finally, they had nothing left to trade. The Van Ormans wanted to move on down the river, but the Myers and the Chases refused to travel, and they needed their help. They kept to their wigwams, praying while the children gathered fuel for the fire and scraped mosses from the rocks. "God's mercy will provide," said Mrs. Myers, but the orphaned children who helped keep them warm and fed were the first to die. The Van Ormans wanted to move on down the river, but Mr. Chase had died from eating too much salmon, they said, and Mrs. Chase was in no shape to travel, and the Myerses would go no further. "God will provide," said Mrs. Myers. "We pray to him for deliverance. It was God's will that those children died, and we will not question God's will. Their death may be his way of helping us preserve our lives." "No," said the Van Ormans. "We have prayed, and our prayers were answered. Just as Abraham did not question God's command that he sacrifice his only son, so we must not question God's sacrifice of these babies, that we might have sustenance and preserve our lives." "No," said the Van Ormans, and they moved on, down the river. Their rescue was nearly at hand, though they could not have known, as the Reich brothers had made it to the Umatilla Agency, and soldiers were mustered to bring in the survivors and punish the murderers. A company of 60 soldiers rode from Fort Walla Walla over the Blues and through the Powder River Valley. They crossed the divide into the Burnt River drainage, and then along the banks of the Malheur River they found tracks of women and children in the soft sand. On they pushed in the fading light of day, eager to reach the survivors. The sun went down, the moon rose high, and then, in the moonlight, the soldiers approached the Van Ormans. Gleaming white on the banks of the river, stripped and mutilated, and riddled with arrows. Mr. and Mrs. Van Orman lay dead, along with their oldest son and 2 sons of Elijah Utter. The tracks of their murderers led off into the desert, and with them the bare feet of 4 small children, the last of the Van Orman family, captives of the Indians. The soldiers followed, but the trail soon ended and disappeared. Those children are still captives, we must assume, or have died in their captivity, which would be a better fate than the depravities and humiliations of life among those savages. The rescue party moved on up the river until they caught wind of a horrible stench, the smell of burning flesh, and then through a clearing they saw a group of skeletons thinly covered with white skin, the last survivors of the utter party, rushed at the soldiers as they arrived, crying for food, food, food. Their eyes sunk deep in their heads and gleaming with madness. They rose at them from a pit, the grave of poor Mr. Chase, long dead, but now exhumed from his rest, with one limb removed, cooking on a spit. Several of the soldiers, veterans of many battles and no strangers to atrocities, fell from their horses with grief and sickness at what they had seen.